we're gonna present our proposal that it's called an integrative view of collective action for human and social development. So here is our outline. And our general objective is to create a convergence between the ecological psychology and the enactive approaches towards collective action. As an example, we're going to use the case of autism spectrum disorders in order to create this rethinking and reconsideration of collective action. So, first of all, our theoretical approaches begin from the ecological psychology. In this sense, we are taking into account the environment based on these pivotal notions. The first one is the Umwelt and also the habitat that were deeply defined by Bax and Chamero in 2018. The first one, that is the Umwelt, is how is created the individual set of affordances given its biological setup, its development, and its individual history. Then the next notion is the habitat, that is the environment as a set of resources for a typical or ideal member of a species that share a form of life. In this sense, we are highlighting this, right? Like the member of species that share a form of life in a typical or ideal way, because it's a consensuated form of life from certain group that could exclude other forms of life. And we will further explain this in the next slides. Then it's the affordances 2.0 notion that was deeply defined by Chamero. Affordances 2.0 is a relational and dynamical way of thinking affordances, in which affordances and the abilities of the living organism co-interact in real time, and they are causally dependent. As we know, affordances, the term of affordances, was first defined by James Gibson and Eleanor Gibson. And there are like many concepts, but in this one, in a dynamical and relational way of thinking, it entails that affordances depend on the particular history of development of the organism, that is the ontogeny, and thus the affordances are subjective and salient for a particular individual when the individual perceives and acts upon them. So the world that an organism inhabits and experiences throughout its life will depend on its physiological needs, its repertoires of sensory motor schemes, and the affordances in a relational way of thinking that permit the individual or living organism to establish functional patterns to interact with the environment, okay? Now, in this sense, we are also going to talk about the notion of the affordative space. So the affordative space implies many dimensions into the space that can be seen as the habitat, that, as we know, is a consensuated environment based on a form of life. And this one was defined by Gallagher and Ranson, and it's defined as the abstract range of possibilities provided by any active movement in body or change in environment. So the affordative space implies these dimensions. First, the evolution, that is the species anatomical differences. Then is the development, that involves the developmental parameters along the life cycle of the living organism. And then is the social-cultural practices that involve the social normativity and the ontological niche. So these dimensions will enable and constrain the individual's action possibilities. Now, the next theoretical approach is the censoring motor approach that was deeply defined by Ezequiel Di Paolo, Burman, and Barandiaran in 2017, in which, as in the enactive view we see it, the living systems are networks of dynamical processes. So dynamical processes involve also the sensory motor regularities that cannot be also named as sensory motor contingencies or sensory motor coordinations that happen through patterns of agent-environment interactions, bodily coordinations also, and also the coordinations between the environmental processes and the agent. And as we said before, the sensory motor regularities are contextualized in certain time and they are historized. So the movement in the sensory motor space can be generated by the closed loop system in a given situation during a certain period of time. So the sensory motor abilities are coupled with the niche also. The niche is defined as the network of affordances available to the animal. So the sensory motor trajectories are, for example, when we walk in our daily life, how we grasp, how we explore the world, and how we coordinate with other agents and the environment and with our own bodily interactions. Now, the next theoretical approach is the sense making. So, in the enactive view, we conceive cognition as the sense making of the world based on our organismic self organization, our embodiment, our needs, our skills, and the situation, the lived situation. So, taking into account the previously defined concept of Umwelt, that, as we know, is the way the organism inhabits and experiences the environment based on their biological instances or their biological organization. We are taking into account also the sensory motor schemes or sensory motor regularities, the perception and action situated in the space time that will guide what it appears to be meaningful for the agent and toward which the agent orients her actions. So, in this sense, agents actively make sense of their environment in terms of how it affects to them. And the sense making is based on the concept of autonomy. That is also a pivotal concept of the enactive view, in which the living organisms self generate, self distinct, and self organize. So the agents establish a perspective from which interactions with the world acquire a meaningful and normative status. So the organisms cast a web of significance of the world grounded on their biological organization and the interaction with the world itself. So, in this sense, taking all of these concepts, we are kind of like proposing to rethink collective action also based on these next notions. First is the cultural permeation that was introduced by Ines Hipólito, Daniel Juto, and Gallagher in 2021. And they talk about how the culture permeates and how it connects and influences cognition based on a dynamical coupling in which the organism systems attune with the environment to physical, social, and cultural factors. So, a great example for this kind of cultural permeation is the essay made by Iris Marion Young, who is a feminist phenomenologist, in Throwing Like a Girl. That is the name of the essay. And she talks about how women, adolescents, and girls, how we attune our physical and perception and action capacities based not only in our sensory motor regularities, but also on the action possibilities given by the social cultural practices imposed by the gender structure of femininity. So I really recommend this essay if you want to look further about this kind of thinking. And the next notion is also the social materiality and the joint action, in which the first one, the social materiality, is on how mental activities are not considered as decontextualized or isolated, but they are interwoven in interactions among living systems, among individuals, and also among the physical and social worlds with the living organisms. So, in this sense, we are taking into account the objects that surrounds us, that seem to actively contribute to the typical and atypical psychological development, that is the cognitive, affective, and social development, influencing to several degrees the way that we experience the world. So we are taking not only the agents and the environment, but also the spaces, objects, and its interwoven relations. And the final notion in this slide is the situated normativity. The situated normativity is the ability of the skilled individuals to distinguish better or worse or adequate from inadequate or correct from incorrect in the context of a particular situation. So the situated normativity consists in a situated appreciation expressed in normative behavior that is concentrated by certain form of life. This connects profoundly with the conception of habitat. And then the next notion for rethinking collective action is the participatory sense making. That is the concept in the enactive view for intersubjectivity. So we illustrate it with the figure made by Hannah de Jager, who is a really great philosopher from the 4E cognition approach, in which she explains that the participatory sense making is made by two living systems that depart from a kind of sense making based on their sensory motor schemes, their development, and their historical cycle, their historical context. And then they create another system that will be called their participatory sense making. So they participate in each other's sense making. So the participatory sense making involves dynamical actions such as breakdowns, repairs, and transformations of the agent concerned in the relationship, in the interaction itself. So in this sense, the 4E cognition proposes to study the interaction itself, the intercorporeal dialogical relationship that we create during our interaction. Now, Melina.
Problems of thinking social cognition in individual terms, rather than really in interactional terms. So as Gallagher said, rather than making an inference to what the other person is intending by starting with bodily movements and moving from there to the level of mental events, we see actions as meaningful in the context of the physical and intersubjective environment. Moreover, he highlights the importance of the environment not only as a physical location, but as a pragmatic context in a social situation. So in this regard, the world itself does much of the work involved in social cognition. Furthermore, and trying to find a way that covers the whole interaction of the agent-environment system in constant and changing interactions, a physical model we think can explain this proposal could be found in ecological resonance. This ecological resonance is the activity of the perceiver in her environment, like the perceiver environment dynamics, and how it generates perceptual information that subsequently constrains the dynamics of perceptual systems. That is, the neural dynamics of perceptual systems, in terms of informational coupling or synchronization, such that the perceiver's perceptual systems resonate to the perceiver environmental dynamics. This is proposed by Raja in 2019, and then by Chemero, Anderson, and Raja 2020. Accordingly, we propose that different approaches to collective action can be conceptualized in real-time social interactions with this approach, arguing that some assumptions have been treated as trying, like active inference, can contradict some of the basic features of sensory motor trajectories that we have sketched here. In particular, the historicity of the agency and the sense-making that is explicit. So furthermore, and as just has been published by Raja and colleagues in 2021, active inference presupposes successful perception and actions instead of explaining them, which precisely in the case of ASD that we're going to treat in a few slides, many problems are presented when we discuss the term successful. So we will expand on this. Okay, so part of our model that we are trying to propose here has to do with understanding these interactions, the dynamics of the sensory motor schemes trajectories in the affordative space. So these sketches that we made are based on Di Paolo's and Hannah de Jager's proposals in several of their books. But what we are trying to say here in the first figure is that the mutuality of the autopoietic system in interaction with the environment is generating the necessary autonomy to develop sensory motor schemes. Then in the middle one, what we are seeing is the interactions that are depicted as the pointed line ones, maybe, yeah, exactly, those ones. And they are continuous and bidirectional, which means that there's feedback between the body and the environment, generating affordances for the agent and the particular sensory motor schemes that get mastered over development to configure an autonomous system with particular basic abilities, like walking, grasping, drinking, etc. And then on the third one, we can see the bidirectional umbels generating through development, like an affordative space that constitutes the ontogenetic niche in the environment, which itself has its own trajectory that transforms both the agent and the niche over time. Yeah.
Yeah, so given this perspective, it is also important to acknowledge that each affordative space generates umvelts, in this sense, for example, that have an intrinsic affectivity that pertains to the understanding of the world of each individual. Therefore, in specific cultures, the interactions, for example, depicted in the figure one, becoming differentiated understanding and apprehension of the world that is the habitat. So, specific normativities portray specific affectivities towards the world that in turn are experienced through affordances and become part of the identity of each organism or individual. And when those experiences are shared in social groups, then they are differentiated. So, what is usually called like abnormal behaviors, or pervasive behaviors could be better understood as different from the norm. Like a different relationship to the habitat, understood as a generation of different sensory motor schemes and therefore different affordances and sense makings than those that are called typical. So there is a relation, an umvelt, and it is constituted differently but not abnormally or pervasively. So in this sense, we are taking into account the case of autism spectrum disorders to rethink on how we research on collective action, right? So autism spectrum disorders, briefly, they are conceived as the differentiated communication, social communication and social interaction conditions in which they present repetitive and restrictive behaviors, such as in the repetitive behaviors such as echolalia, mannerisms, stereotypic behaviors, or also rocking, and also esteeming, that is the stimulating themselves with different parts like objects from the world. Also hypersensitivity in different sensory modalities, and yeah, and also they present different kinds of affectivities towards other agents, and they can also present delayed languages. No, sorry, delayed in the language. Yeah, and they have like differentiated communication towards other people. So the traditional view of autism departs from these theories, basically. First one is the dysfunction triad that involves the theory of mind, the weak coherence theory, and the executive dysfunction theory, and also the systemizing theory. So in the dysfunction triad, they talk about, in a representational and functional way, they talk about a deficit in autism, a deficit in, for example, theory of mind, and they relate it to directly to a lack of, for example, activity in the nervous system, in the central nervous system, right? And the next theory, the systemizing theory, it was defined by Simon Baron Cohen, and he talks about autism as a hyper-masculine type of phenotype, yeah, in which he says that by having a higher systemizing ability, they have lower empathy capacities. So apart from that, there are many objections, for example, from bioethics and also from the furry cognition view and also from the feminist epistemology towards these kind of theories. We want to also focus on how they depart from a biomedical model of disability and otherness, in which they consider autism as a condition to cure, eliminate, or fix. For example, it translates on applications in therapies in which they conceive the repetitive and restrictive behaviors that are autistic traits as unpurposed, inappropriate, or aberrant. So they prohibit them or eliminate them. Um, so, in contrast, we are departing from an enactive and embodied cognition view that, in this sense, Hannah de Jager deeply defined it. And she says that autism is a distinctive sense making. So, according to her, the autism spectrum conditions comprehend a different kind of sense making, therefore, a different participatory sense making. That, as we know, is the enactive concept for intersubjectivity or our capacity to interact socially. Accordingly, their capacity to interact, communicate, coordinate, engage, and establish dialogical relationships will be distinct. So we put here an instance that is pivotal because I think that it shows how the social affordances, how the affordative space is involved, is the case of autistic women and girls, because they not only depart from a distinctive sense making, but they also depart from the social pressure, from a social normativity that is in the gender structure of femininity, in which they show how they have to mask the autistic traits during their development, because the social pressures of femininity for them are really, really, really tough. And they have to express themselves in a way in which they hide their, for example, mannerisms, their ecolalias, or also their stereotypic behaviors or destining. In this sense, we recommend the study led by Sara Bargiela in 2016. So, Hannah de Jager says that autistic particularities of moving, perceiving, and emoting relate to how people with autism make sense of the world. So, the restrictive and repetitive behaviors could involve an engagement with the social cultural world and also an appropriation and an affective discharge through their umwelts. So, we are taking the autistic traits as their own umwelts, as their form of life, and also as their own sense making, like an autistic umwelt. So, in our way of rethinking collective action in cognitive science, is not only to take into account different umwelts, but also to consider participants in our research as autonomous agents, based also in the participatory sense making notion. So here we put a testimony by Karen Rose, who is an autistic woman, and she says, "We move, communicate, and think in ways that those who do not move, communicate, and think in those ways struggle to empathize with or understand, so they other us, pathologize us, and exclude us for it." So, in this sense, we propose not only this model for research, but also ethical and future perspectives for cognitive sciences that involve psychology, psychiatry, pedagogy, philosophy, data science. And in this sense, we first talk about the neurodivergence emancipatory collective movement that is led by autistic people. First by Judy Singer, who is also a female with autism or an autistic female. And also, in this sense, we should rethink our therapeutic applications. So here we put some examples in which we think that they consider the autistic sense making or the autistic umwelt, that is the intensive interaction therapy, in which they depart from the sense making in terms of communication and interaction of autistic people in order to create a dialogical relationship between the, for example, the psychologist and the autistic child. And then the floor time and the relationship with the social materiality notion, because in the floor time therapy, they depart from the horizontality between, for example, the caregiver and the autistic child, in which they take into account the autistic sense making with the objects that surround them in order to play and interact based in the umwelt that the autistic child creates. Also, another application could be sensory-friendly spaces in which, as considering autistic people as participants, as autonomous agents by themselves, we should create also spaces that are friendly for them because they live with hyper or hyposensitivities that mislead their actions, or not in that sense, that create like a really bad place for them, or an aversive kind of situation. And also, instead of imposing rules for interaction, we should understand their ways of engagement. And in this sense, we also propose an engaged and unsituated epistemologies, for example, from the feminist standpoint, from Donna Haraway, Dorothy Smith, and Sandra Harding, in which we include and amplify the voices of autistic people by taking them as experts by experience. And also, for collective action, we should research on communities and not isolated individuals. And also think on cognition in an embodied and participatory way for social understanding and collective action. And also the critique interculturality. So, Melina, if you.
Yeah, in this sense, we also think that to treat interculturality in a horizontal way, which is proposed by Catherine Walsh, and she calls it critique interculturality, because then we can acknowledge difference, and we can acknowledge different kind of cultures, and in this way we are talking about an autistic disorder spectrum culture, and then be treated like a horizontal with the normality, or what is called normality. So it is also a political standpoint to treat it in this way, in critical interculturality, and not as an abnormality.
So, as drawing the conclusions, we say that affordances are co-created and maintained by joint action, which form particular ecological niches or habitats and other agencies. However, the normative behavior settings exclude other ways of acting that differ from the consensuated ones. So, diverse ways of comprehension and action in the world should be considered, or sorry, are considered in this kind of thinking of the normative behavior as impaired, pervasive, or abnormal, and can be misjudged ethically. So, autistic people express differences in participatory sense making, that is, they show different ways of acting, emoting, and communicating. So, autistic people respond to the landscape of affordances, the affordative space, in such way that resonates with their sensory motor constitution. So, we're talking about different umwelts, not abnormal umwelts. So, thank you very much. Here our emails if you want to talk about it much more. And here also thank you for the Cognition group that coordinates Melina. And yeah, that's all.
So whoever wants to ask questions can just get behind me in the line here and ask Itzel and Melina their questions from the podium.
Okie doke. Guess I'll go first. So I guess I have a question about how one, or maybe how might all imagine creating spaces that both simultaneously, I guess, engage the sensory motor preferences or umwelt, right, of autistic people, while also allowing them exposure to other niches, right, or other environments in which there are other modes of engagement, right? Because maybe the concern I have is if you cater too much to that disposition, there becomes no understanding or inclination to understand other mindsets or ways of interacting with the world. And maybe it's unclear, so forgive me if that is.
Melina, I think I didn't understand the question. I'm sorry.
No worries. So maybe the context is, so, the reframe of it is not being abnormal, but a different kind of umwelt, right? I think resonates. The concern would be is only allowing them exposure into one environment that naturally fits with their sensory motor experience does not allow them to be flexible, right, and switch into a different niche that may not be as forgiving. Does that make sense? So maybe they go to a job interview, and because they've been in an environment, where like they didn't understand certain social norms, and they start engaging in behaviors, or repetitive movements, or things that don't go well, right? And maybe affects their chances for employment at that firm, or just as a random example.
Yeah, I think it resonates with our proposal. Like, I think it's a good way of translating it, because they usually show these affective discharges of, like, for example, the repetitive and restricted behaviors that usually are called also like unflexibility towards the environment. During certain situations in which they have, for example, anxiety crisis, because the environment is really aversive towards their sensory motor capabilities or coordinations. For example, in spaces like here in Mexico, like in the center of the city, that it's really, really full of hyperstimulation from all over the place. Usually people with autism that I have talked to, because I work in a clinical space and also in a research space with autistic people, they usually refer that it's a really aversive place in which they have to kind of like look for something in order to calm themselves down. But that is also impossible because they don't have, as we said, for example, in the part of the ethical and future perspectives, they don't have sensory friendly spaces, not even to calm themselves and maybe to calm the anxiety crisis. So yeah, I think it's a good way of translating what you did, yeah, or what you said.
And I guess, just another addendum is, I wonder if things like mindfulness meditation or cognitive behavioral therapy, right, or certain behavioral, right, interventions and cognitive methods might be helpful facilitating, success in those environments, or at least not being, essentially overwhelmed. Just some random ideas, and something that has a very personal aspect to it for me. So thank you. I'll let someone else go now.
Thank you, Kevin.
Hi there. Thanks for this really interesting talk. I don't study autism, but I have heard recently a lot about the phenomenon of masking, where you can suppress sort of stimming tendencies or other abnormal autistic behaviors. And that the fact that masking exists tells me that autistic individuals have maybe their usual mode of sensory motor coordination with the world, but also the capability of having neurotypical sensory motor engagements with the world, which would suggest that neurotypical folks are actually have this abnormal lack of flexibility, where the world has to be this normative way where you've been taught, conditioned, interacted, and can't accept other ways of interacting. And so I'm wondering what is the explanation for masking behavior, and maybe like is there a characterization of sort of normative behavior as actually being the abnormal, inflexible behavior rather than good and what we should strive for?
Well, I think that there is no explanation, like formally speaking, from the enactive view, like that there is a paper talking about how we explain the masking, but I think that we can infer based on what we are proposing, and also based on, for example, Hannah de Jager's view, in which, and also based on the lived experience referred by autistic people, and specifically autistic adolescents, women and girls, because they are the population that mostly present the masking that is also referred as camouflaging. And in this sense, is a cope mechanism that takes a lot of effort, a lot of energy from them, and it's not something that is developed like instantly or spontaneously in the moment. It's something that they shape along their history of living of coping with the normative space. For example, I am thinking about a woman that I interviewed a few days ago. She's an autistic woman, and she talks about how she developed a cope mechanism of masking her steaming and cope mechanism to hide the rocking that she does when she's really, really excited. And she says that is not something that she spontaneously did, like in the first time, but it is much more like an aversive association because of the social stigma that is in the space, you know? So I think that maybe we should talk about not normal or abnormal, but different instances of behaving or different instances of sense making, and maybe also not to put like a moral imperative on how we should behave, you know, like I don't know if this is making sense. But
yeah, this is really helpful context. Thank you.
I don't know if Melina also wants to say something.
No, for now it's okay. I think you answered very well. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Shannon.
Thank you.
All right. Hi. Thank you for your talk. So I would like you elaborate a bit between the melange of concepts that you use, especially the unwelt. Why the unwelt could be or similar or different or akin to affordances of Gibson, and to what extent that is similar to an action, to what extent also these three concepts are similar to a structural coupling, because these four concepts that I said have something in common, but also have substantial differences. For example, in action, if you see the chapter 9 of Varela Thompson Roche, the embodied mind, which I mean that's the central book that they put forward for an action, they make a substantial difference with Gibson affordances. While for Gibson affordances the reality is outside, an action still believes that, or still argue that is a sensomotorium action. So a sense making. So it is still there is no independent reality of the action of the organism. So I would like you elaborate a bit more between these four concepts, no? Wealth, affordances, and action, and structural coping. And to what extent they relate or not to active inference.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question, Sergio. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of controversy about the affordance concept. So if you take it just like the Gibson's first book in 1979, the concept is not really clear. So there have been several approaches to it, and we skipped that part because we just took the affordances 2.0 approach from Chemero. But let me expand a little bit on this. The idea is that if you see affordances as dispositions in the environment for agents to interact with, you are, of course, talking about an independent reality, and that would contradict enactivism or some of the basic standards of enactivism. But precisely what Chemero and Edward Bax do in a paper in 2018 is to split the idea of the physical world, which is Gibson's term, into two: the habitat, which is the set of affordances that are there for the form of life, which would be, for example, for the species, for human species, and then the affordances that are there for particular individuals. that take them from the habitat. So you have a difference in information for and information about. No? So you have information for the species, and that's the habitat, that's the general affordances that are available for a particular form of life. And then you have the information about, which is about the particular abilities of the individual, which also is in accordance with Gibson's first postulation, that is to mix and complete objectivity and subjectivity, neither one of them, no? Which has this very famous quote that is a bit of ambiguous, no? And everyone has talked about it. So what we want to say, talking about this, is that umwelts, seen in this sense, that is affordances for particular animals, once they become in interaction with those affordances, have two constitutive parts, and the word constitutive is very important. No, there are the abilities and there are the features of the environment, and the abilities are made by sensory motor schemes. So the abilities are what gets coupled or gets in interaction with certain features of the environment. And so in that sense, you can use the term affordance in interaction with enactive approaches. And I mean, there are many enactive theories that support that idea. In that sense, no, that sensory motor interactions are autonomous, are adaptive, are self-defining, but all the way through they have to interact with the environment. And when that interaction happens, that is the structural coupling, and that's the affordance. I hope I made myself clear. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Indeed. Right. So the question is then, well, they somehow they are talking about the same thing. You have basically, I think so, as far as I know, two different approaches to how the organisms act on its environment. One is a reactive paradigm, which is based on feedbacks only, and feedbacks are just error counteracting behavior. So the error has to take place in order to the organism correct that. This is a very mechanistic explanation. So Ashbean and cybernetic explanation. Then you have what is quite a bit different, in the sense that organisms are not anymore reactive systems, so that the organisms indeed anticipate, and in this case, make active inference of the environment. So based on either anticipative models of the environment or generative models, as Cal, for instance, uses to talk about. So, but Robert Rosen also talks about anticipative models. So how you can connect affordances and unwealth with these non-reactive behaviors of the organisms. In the sense, non-reactive behaviors, I am saying anticipative behaviors. So you are placing the organism as a passive entity that only reacts, or the organism can anticipate indeed things and can make active inference of its environment. And based on this active inference that the organism is doing, can change present behavior. So so far what I got is that there is some kind of tension there in explanation regarding active inference. So how do you place that?
You go or I go? Okay.
You know.
Okay, one thing is that I hope I understood well your question, but one thing is that the prediction that you are talking about is some of the things that we are concerned about when we talk about active inference, because exactly what the inactive / ecological, in this sense that we just explained, this mixture offers is more a sense of being of having habits, much more in a pragmatic John Dewey's sense than to be predicting every time we interact with the environment. So the sensory motor schemes become attuned with the environment, and that's why we think that ecological resonance makes a good point, because it is the environment that is leading the way the behavioral body reacts. So there's no anticipation. You have to be there to be interacting with the affordances, the multiple affordances that are in that place. So if they are not there, you couldn't do it. So even though you are predicting, you wouldn't be interacting in the way you are doing in that precise time, because sometimes, like for example with depression, you can be in front of the same affordances and not being able to interact with them because you have a particular state of mood or affective mood, etc. So what we think is that just talking about active inference in this sense, active inference can give us many answers to very interesting particularities, but not to this, to the trajectory of the particular umwelts that the agent has. I don't know if you want to add something, Itzel.
Thank you, answer all.
Thanks.
I will
Thank you,
move
because I know that we are running on time.
Yeah. Well, I let the talk last a little bit longer because the 4:30 talk is has been canceled, so we do have a little more time. I think there was a question by Marco, but Itzel and Melina, if you want to answer, it's fine, or maybe you're tired, or so it's up to you. Would you like Marco to ask his question?
Yeah, it's okay. It's okay.
Okay, great.
I also saw that there is like a really good discussion going on the chat, and I am really excited. Like, it's so good. Yeah. Sorry, go, Marco.
Thank you. Really interesting talk. I'm a bit sleep deprived, so sorry if I'm not making sense or if I missed something in your talk. So in the chat, I had just a clarification question, because there was this nice images you had with the nice loops of the bidirectional flows, but yet the N and the S within, what did they stand for?
Nervous system.
Oh, okay, fair enough. And a more big picture question is I very much empathize with many of the points you make, but I can't escape a kind of pessimism, I think. Exactly, active inference, but also ecological resonance. I think because of the different way that we are, as in the distinctively different umwelt as a beauty, it's the diversity has a power. But at the same time, I think it also means that sometimes there is an inescapable, unsurmountable bridge between each other's lived experiences, each other's, let's say, the reality that we see in terms of our own reality, right? And so that I think creates certain barriers for that participatory sense making sometimes. And that's the pessimistic parts. And then my question to you is more, regardless if you agree or not, what is the best way to still make the most out of our neurodiverse society for the sake of collective intelligence? And if we really should encourage or impose or force this, in my opinion, over-romanticized idea that everyone should perfectly get along with each other, I think it's more kind of respect of each other's distinctively different and unique umwelts. And wherever it is possible to find a way to have this mutually enriching participatory sense making, we should. Because like you said, we just have to understand the way we work. but understanding how we work doesn't always immediately translate into a smoother, ideal mutual interaction, right? I have some questions also about active inference and prediction, but I think that's maybe a different theoretical discussion. So yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts about whatever I said.
Well, I think it's a great question. I also used to have that question before. But for example, Hannah de Jager takes into account Maria Lugones' perspective. She's a decolonial epistemological feminist.
Mm-hmm.
And she talks about world traveling in terms of creating a situated and engaged epistemology for science and humanities. And she says that from considering the diverse ways of, in this sense, for example, sense making the world, we should depart from the empathy and understand that there are diverse ways and we can differ, as you said, we are able to differ in our way of sense making of the reality. But that doesn't mean that we should put, as I said before with Sharon, that doesn't mean that we should put a hierarchy on the sense makings. We shouldn't put this is the consensuated or this is the adequate and the only adequate form of comprehension of the world. And she talks about word traveling because she says that we should listen and read and take into account the voices of people in the minorities. And
so very briefly, because I'm confused, with world traveling, do you mean the physical world as in traveling around, or do you mean the lived worlds?
The lived world,
okay.
World traveling in a sense of sense making, because she says that, Maria Lugones says that we create worlds in a individual and collective way, in an abstract way. I'm not saying in a we should travel around the world. I mean, okay.
Maybe one day with Elon Musk.
More in that sense. So I like that way of thinking because I think that we shouldn't put a hierarchy on how we should think or how we should behave. I don't know if I am answering your question.
I think what would be useful is to, first of all, to elaborate how we achieve that. And second of all, though I agree there shouldn't be a universal hierarchy, I think it even though difficult and challenging, especially in the modern social media culture, but I do think it's useful for the communities themselves to figure out a normative framework on how to engage in participatory sense making across different contexts. One example I like to use is the civil rights movement. Right? It's not about just homogeneity. We're all the same. There is a utility in setting norms and giving special roles of leadership, given that there's a consensus that it aligns with the goals of the community as a whole. Right? I think that the danger of hierarchy is othering and suppression and exclusion. But I think it's fine to have a commonly held notion of what ideals to strive for. And I'm wondering how to do that for all the different communities. For example, autism, maybe art is a very powerful way for them to explore their worlds, given the difficulty doing so with the rigidity of normal language. But also what particular, let's say, microcosmos or microcultures can they create, not just for just autism people, but particular artistic people with other particular autistic people, and create a culture around that. How do you see the role of your work or your views for that direction, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think that in a pragmatic sense, on how to do that, a good instance is also described by Hannah de Jager, and she says to let it be.
I love that.
And I know that it's kind of a cliche, but she talks also departing from this kind of situated decolonial thinkings, in which I think that it involves to break some paradigms from the Western world of organization, and I know that it's kind of maybe it's like an utopia of thinking, to think on the transformation on our way of organize. And in a pragmatic sense, for example, in psychology, as you saw in the slides, I was considering the intensive interaction treatment, because in that one, they, I think, depart from a way of thinking in which they don't put the typical or normal kind of communication. If not, what they do is to depart from the sense making that the autistic people create. So, for example, there are many cases reported in some papers, and one of them involves an autistic girl, that her way of interacting with the world was by slapping with her hands the space. She couldn't talk. She couldn't vocalize any kind of sentence or word. And what the psychologist did was to first visualize or observe the way of behaving and interacting of the girl, instead of imposing her own way of communicating. Instead of going to her and saying hi, my name is la la la, what she did was to depart from the way of behaving and the way of interacting of the autistic girl. And I think that in that sense, it could translate to the thing that I said of Maria Lugones of world traveling, to listen to other voices, to listen to the minorities. And that doesn't only involve to just say that they exist, but it also involves to participate in a situated and engaged and active way. I think that would be the pragmatic answer for your question, but I don't know.
Well, I like that you said let be, because one other phrase I really love from Alvear is letting in as knowing, right? And I think, we talk a lot about participation, but I think that is something that should be explicitly mentioned sometimes, because I personally sometimes worry, I don't know if it's justified, that the talk of, I think, inclusive spaces is sometimes used as a shortcut to avoid the more difficult job of actually letting in, right? So the kind of almost robotic algorithmic action of I'll do this and that policy, and then we'll make people feel included, but not actually try to let people into their own reality, even if they're very different from them. And I think that is a distinction that I personally very appreciate from Alvear. And it's become more of a discussion than a question, but thank you. That's very interesting replies.
Thank you very much, Marco. We're gonna take that one. Let it in. It's a really good.
Oh, it's hers, but
yeah, it's a great discussion. Maybe we can keep it going a little bit later on. Thank you, Itzel and Melina, for a great talk, very stimulating talk.